Good afternoon. My name is Haley Delgado, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. One second. On behalf of the Texas Society for Public Health Education, we welcome you to our webinar series kickoff. Today's webinar is titled Public Health and the 2020 Census, Ensuring a Full Count of Texas in 2020. And will be presented by Census Sanchez, who is here representing the NALEO Educational Fund. But before we get started, I would like to review some logistics for today's webinar. So please remember to mute your lines. If you have a question, please feel free to type it in the comment box and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. Please complete the post-webinar evaluation using the survey monkey link provided in the comment box. If you are CHES or MCHES, you are required to complete the evaluation to receive one continuing education unit. If you would also like to be a featured presenter in this year's TSOFI webinar series, please email texassofi@gmail.com. We are accepting proposals up until the month of December. So if you are interested in presenting throughout that time period, please email us and let us know, and we would be more than glad to have you as a presenter for this year's webinar series. Okay, so the NALEO Educational Fund is the nation's leading nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that facilitates full Latino participation in the American political process from citizenship to public service. Representing NALEO today, as mentioned previously, is Census Sanchez. Originally from Irving, Texas, Census is the Texas Regional Census Campaign Manager for the National Association of Latino Electeds and Appointed Officials. She attended Columbia University, where she majored in ethnic studies with a focus on Latino studies. After graduation, she joined the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health, where she supported field teams in the Rio Grande Valley and across the country. Census returned home last spring and led GeoTV and VR field teams that encouraged Latinos in Dallas to become more civically engaged. Now at NALEO, she leads efforts to promote a fair and accurate census count of hard-to-count communities across Texas. And I will now hand it over to Census so that she can begin her presentation.
Awesome, thank you, Haley. So as Haley mentioned, my name is Census. And in my role, I have the privilege of traveling the state and working with community organizations and partners to help get them trained on all things census. One thing about the census is that it's a huge operation, as you can imagine. And so we want to distill a lot of the information that we get and make it accessible to our community members and kind of help them, help us spread the word as trusted messengers in the community. So this is the third census that we've worked on, and we're really proud of the work that we continue to do. And we hope we can act as a resource, not only in this webinar, but also in future conversations that you might have around the census. So to start off, what is the census? By now, most of us probably know what it is, but just to reiterate, the census is a count of every person living in the United States. It takes place every 10 years and is mandated by the Constitution. So a lot of times, one thing that happens is that people don't kind of understand who is doing it, right? They understand, oh, it's the government, but who is it? So the U.S. Census Bureau is the agency that's tasked with conducting the count. And everyone is required to participate no matter their age, race, ethnicity, or immigration status. When this was included in our Constitution, it said that everybody must be counted. It didn't stipulate who or what kind of identity they had to bring in order to be counted. But however, we do recognize that we have had a history of not counting people correctly or not seeing them in their entirety. And that has long-lasting effects, not only on who we are as a society, but also on the count. So I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute here. So why should we care about a fair and accurate census? In Texas, we stand to gain about $60 billion in resources back into our local communities annually for the next 10 years. And those resources are allocated back into things like schools, hospitals, roads, and where, a lot of public services should be built, essentially. It funds federal programs, so programs like Head Start, CHIP, Medicaid, and WIC, and it determines our political representation. So in 2020, we stand to gain about 2 to 3 congressional seats. It could be a little bit more if we get an even better count, but right now the estimate is 2 to 3. And it informs organizational decisions. So for many of you who are practicing or are in this field, you realize like where you work is dependent on census data. So this is a hard to count map of Texas as it is. As you guys can see, a lot of these very hard to count areas are located on the border. We'll talk about why in a second. But they're also kind of located more increasingly in places like East Texas, that's growing, and then some of the big metropolitan areas. As you can imagine, counting a population like the one in Texas is, again, a really difficult operation. We know that we are expected to increase population by 20.6% from 2010 to 2020. And that growth has to be reflected in current infrastructure. I'm sure you guys know, depending on where you live, how hard it is to get to work sometimes because of traffic. In 2010, the census missed about 1.7 million people in Texas, and 75,000 of them were very young children. So this is another point we want to emphasize, that that population is the most likely to be undercounted in any census. And so if you work with this population, to emphasize how important it is for families to fill out the form and to not forget their babies. A 1% undercount in Texas is about 300 million federal funds potentially lost every year for the next 10 years. And so as you guys can see, there's a lot to lose here if we don't get an accurate count. It may not be in the areas that we live, but it could be it could affect us as a state as a whole, and we want to avoid things like that. It's also a public health issue. So as many of you know, the Bureau is the agency that calculates poverty levels based on all the surveys that they do. A lot of low-income families and youth rely on accurate census data because many of them rely on one or more of these programs or assistance. So banks, shelter, things like grocery stores. This is an opportunity for businesses to decide and to see, oh, there's a growing population here. We have the data to show that we're viable and that people need these types of resources. And we know that, especially for our kids, when they're not healthy and they're struggling to meet their basic needs, they will not be good students. And that has a lot of ramifications in the future. Similarly, if they're not getting access to healthcare from a very young age, they're also facing kind of an uphill battle. And so the more that we participate and the more that we encourage community members to participate, the more we help people alleviate a lot of these struggles of poverty. And so we want to, and we know, right, a person, we have to look at them holistically and not just as one part of, not just one part of their identity, and make sure that we're treating all these variables that could be a determinant of their health. So again, looks like this was a copy. This is from 2017. These are the top 12 census guided federal programs. As you guys can see, the biggest one by far is always Medicaid, but then we're looking at things like SNAP, housing vouchers, CHIP, Title I grants, special education grants. You don't see it here, but right behind them are things like WIC and free and reduced lunch. So again, when we have healthy children, when we have a healthy community, we know that they thrive more. And so by participating, we have an opportunity to help them be healthier servants in our community. Just an example of where we kind of stand. Interestingly enough, the population of New York State is lower than the population of Texas, but they receive more federal funds because they had a better count. So this is what happens on a state level when we get an undercount. And so just to show you a snapshot of what that looks like, This is from 2016. And then, as I mentioned, the history of how we've counted people in this country has been pretty long and at times really bad. And so what has happened is that there's certain populations that are undercounted, and they include Black, Latino, Indigenous folks, people who are low income, immigrants and individuals with low English language proficiency, people who rent. So I'm based in Houston, and as an example, 50% of people in Houston rent, and that's a really high percentage, and it shows us a lot about how much housing is increasing. Residents who live in non-traditional housing, people who live in rural areas, people who are highly mobile, so think about people like farm workers or even oil rig workers, the very young, age 0 to 4, communities affected by natural disasters, disabled individuals, and the elderly. And about 25% of our population lives in these hard to count areas. And we know it could be more. Anecdotally, we know that people are not just one identity, they are many. And so we want to encourage, if you work with this population, know that you'll have to have some extra touch or maybe a little bit more guidance on the census, because they may not be, the Census Bureau might not get them in their traditional media efforts or in certain types of outreach. Another takeaway slide. So this is what happened in 2010. Texas gained 4 seats in the House. We took them from places like we took them from places like New York State. And we're likely to do the same thing as well in 2020. And again, the better the count, the more seats we potentially grab from other states. Oh, it's funny, it's been repeating itself. Sorry about that, y'all. So when we say people are defined as hard to count, we mean that they're hard to contact. So they may be homeless, they move a lot, or they don't have a permanent address. They're hard to locate. So they might live in colonias, in another person's home, or in some type of informal housing situation. They're hard to survey. So maybe they don't speak English very well. They don't have, their literacy is limited, or they don't have internet access, or they're hard to engage. So they say they're afraid, they distrust the government, or they don't have the time to complete the form. And we've seen increasingly like that these different identities are really coming up in Texas. People who have traditionally had a lot of trust in the government now don't. So they're becoming harder to engage. So it adds a little bit of difficulty to the work that we're doing, but know that we're trying to overcome those barriers as well. So as I mentioned, very young children are the most likely to be missed from the census count. In 2010, we had a net undercount of 1 million children. 400,000 of those were Latino children. And the net undercount rate for Latino and Black children is worse than their white counterparts. And again, the reason for this is because parents many times don't realize that their babies count. And one thing I want to share here is that when you're sharing any kind of information about the census, you want to emphasize to people to make sure their babies count. When we say very young children, people still think, well, maybe that child, they're referring to the child that's already in school, not to my newborn baby, because my newborn baby doesn't access services. But as you guys can see, those federal programs are those services that newborn babies access. So it's important to realize that. And then again, people realize that they need to return the form, but they may or may not include their child for the reason that they don't know that they should have included them, but other things as well. Maybe like they have a fear of other agencies checking or corroborating information about their children, and they want to avoid that. So this is a group where we have a lot of work to do, but with enough outreach, we're hopeful that we can target these communities. So in 2020, we're facing new challenges, as you guys can imagine. The Bureau has less funding. They've been underfunded for the past 10 years, which means that they have less of a field presence. They're not as able to help people or to go to every community event and to provide a lot of those resources. People will now have the option to respond online, which the Bureau said they really wanted people to do. Unfortunately, as we know, sometimes people don't have access to the internet for whatever reason, or they don't feel comfortable using a computer, or they don't feel comfortable submitting their information online. So we want to make sure to emphasize, as I'll share in a few slides, that you have a lot of options. It's not an online only survey. And then there was a last minute attempt to add the citizenship question to the form, which we saw based on prior research would have depressed participation and unfortunately has done the damage in the sense that a significant amount of people still believe that there's a question about citizenship on the census. So we have a lot of work ahead in terms of dispelling a lot of misinformation from the very beginning. So how do people get invited? So you have an option to self-respond to the census. You do this in 3 ways. You can call, you can go online, or you can wait for your mailed form. The Bureau is going to start sending out invitations in about 2 weeks, starting March 12th. Some of those households are going to receive paper questionnaires from the very beginning, and they'll do this in census tracts where they see that there's low internet connectivity, or there's a lot of, there may be a lot of Spanish-speaking households. So they'll see this group might struggle to go online, so let's give them a paper form in the beginning. But this is only about 20% of households. If you respond online and by phone pretty immediately, the Bureau will see your response and they'll kind of put you into a do not contact list. So let's say you don't respond in that first week, the Bureau will come back and say, hey, here's just a reminder, please don't forget to fill out your 2020 census. If you continue to not respond, the Bureau will continue to bug you, basically. So they say, in the 3rd week, they'll send you a postcard and say, hey, we sent you some information, please make sure to fill it out. And then by the 4th mailing, if you didn't already receive that first mailing, this is the first time everyone will get a mailed questionnaire if they haven't responded already. So in that 4th mailing, everybody in the United States should have had or received some level of invitation to participate in the census. And then in the final week of April, this is a final reminder. So let's say you miss all of these reminders for any reason, the Bureau will send you a final postcard that says, hey, it's not too late. And then after this point, we'll see what is called non-response follow-up, which I'll talk about in a second. This is what the sample invitation letter looks like. And what's key to remember here is that the letter will be made out to a dear resident and not to a specific person. As you can imagine, because the Bureau depends on addresses, they can't send it to any individual person. So anytime somebody says, well, they sent this to me and they sent it directly to me, that's something of a red flag and we want to make sure to keep an eye on it. Additionally, the Bureau will send a letter first, not a postcard. And again, it'll be addressed to the address and not to any specific person in the household. And on this form, as you'll see, there's something here called your census ID. This census ID helps the Bureau in case you go online or call. You'll give them your ID and they'll tag it to your household. And that's really about it. So you have the opportunity to still respond if you don't have the census ID. So what will the questionnaire ask? And this is important because this is a way, by knowing this is a way that we combat misinformation and disinformation. So in the 2020 census, the questionnaire is going to ask us, how many people are living or staying in the house, apartment, or mobile home on April 1st, 2020? It'll ask whether the residence is a house, apartment, or mobile home. It'll ask you for your telephone number, and then that's for the household. And then for every person in the household, they'll ask for sex, age, date of birth, Hispanic origin, and race, and the relationships of persons in the household, including opposite and same-sex spouses and unmarried partners. It's also important to know, again, to combat disinformation, what will the questionnaire not ask? So the 2020 census cannot ask you about citizenship status, immigration status, social security number, your permits or licensing of any converted units on the property, the use of public benefits, criminal background or convictions, bank account or payment information, employment, income, or wealth information. And the reason that we like to share this with community members is because sometimes you have to say the quiet part out loud. They may have a circumstance in which, let's say they signed a lease that said they could only have 4 people, but because of whatever circumstances, they actually have about 8 or 10 people living with them. That's okay. But knowing the population and knowing what kind of situations they might be dealing with, you want to reassure them that they won't ask anything about that. And additionally, they can't corroborate any type of information. So this is going to be really important as people start to hear a lot about the census in the next 2 weeks. and they're going to say, well, I don't want to count everybody in my home because the circumstances that I'm living in are a little complicated. We want to assure them that regardless of how complicated they may be, everybody in the household counts, and it's very, very important that they be as accurate and truthful as possible. So as you can imagine, this period between March 12th and April 30th is kind of this key period in which people can self-respond. Why would we promote this time so heavily? Well, it's 3 reasons. So it prevents enumerators from coming to your door, which a lot of people don't like, and not just people who maybe are undocumented, etc. A lot of people just don't like getting knocks at the door, right? And 2, we get better data. The closer that people respond to April 1st, the better data we get. We've seen this time and time again over the past few census, where if you wait too long, if you have to be nudged a lot, you'll kind of fill it out of obligation, and you'll very quickly just, fill out kind of the bare minimum and send it back just so somebody can stop bothering you. And we want to avoid that because we know that we need really good, accurate data to ensure that our communities are accurately counted, and so the resources are accurately allocated as well. And another thing is that it's less costly for the Bureau. So the Bureau, as you can imagine, printing and sending paper, sending enumerators costs a lot of money. Here in Houston, enumerators are getting paid about $26 to $27 an hour. You guys can imagine that money adds up really quickly for the Bureau. And so in this case, we want to also help redirect resources to other communities. The Census Bureau is going to have something of a live map, and in that live map, you'll see participation based on census tracts. And so that's also going to be another opportunity for us to help support their work to see, okay, who's responding in real time, and where do we need to either deploy local strategies or get someone who's like well known in the community to help participation. So as I mentioned, that census ID helps you tag your address to the household. However, you don't need it. And this is going to be really important, especially for people who maybe they live in those complicated households where the person who is the main household doesn't really talk to them. Maybe they live in the garage in the back and they're not getting mail in a traditional way. It could be a number of things. So even if you don't have this ID, you can still go ahead and respond online or by telephone. And then again, if you feel like maybe you weren't counted by your household, you can go ahead and call. They'll take your information, and the Bureau has processes to deduplicate the data. The one thing we do want to mention is that you can't request a paper form by calling the Census Bureau. So this is going to be really key. A lot of people will say, well, I'll just call them and get another paper form because I lost mine or I threw it away. At that point, the Bureau is going to just get you on the phone and say, hey, I already have you here. Let me catch that information. They're not going to spend their resources sending papers to households that may or may move, that may or may not get them. And so this may come up as a challenge, but we're hopeful that it won't be too big of a deal. So as you can imagine, big operation in a country as diverse as ours, the Bureau has to offer a lot of language assistance. So for phone support and online, we have English and 12 non-English languages. So they're listed here. And then the paper form is only available in English and Spanish, and only select households will receive both. So the Bureau goes back and they look at census tracts in which people predominantly speak Spanish, or there's not enough language assistance in the area for whatever reason, and they'll decide, okay, this is a household that will need to get a bilingual form. So unfortunately, the paper forms don't offer any language assistance besides for Spanish, but the Bureau has created things like language identification cards, language glossaries, and language guides in 59 non-English languages. So this could look like a video, for example, where they show how to fill out the form, and then a person can try to do their best in doing so in English. That's one way. It could also be that someone comes to the door and they're talking to someone who doesn't speak English. So they'll have a card, and the Bureau enumerator will tell the person, could you point to the language that you speak? and then they'll go back to their central office and bring someone who can speak that language. So they want to make as many resources available to community members, knowing that there's a limit to kind of some language access, and we're hopeful that this will be enough for most of our communities. So one thing we emphasize over and over again with the census is that your data is confidential and can't be used against you. So, and we know this because of Title 13. Census data, under Title 13, census data can only be used for statistical purposes. The government cannot share any data you give them with law enforcement, so this includes DHS or ICE, your landlord, your employer, or any other government agencies. Personal census information cannot be disclosed for 72 years. So the first census that we can look at where we have some semblance of identifying information is from the 1940s. So right now you can go online, and if you know that your family was here there, then you can see if they participated in the 1940 census. And then finally, Census Bureau staff who have access to your personal information are sworn for life to protect your confidentiality. So sworn staff are subjected to a $250,000 fine and/or up to 5 years in prison for wrongful disclosure of information. And they take this very seriously. So you'll see emphasize over and over again, just especially as we're coming up to it, that the Bureau is trying to prevent fraud. They're trying to prevent people from or they're trying to prevent communities from working with bad actors. And so they'll emphasize this over and over again. And we know too that there's been a lot of political noise about the citizenship question and the executive order. And the important thing here is that we're working to, we're kind of keeping an eye on that and making sure that they can't continue to attempt to infringe on people's privacy. And that research shows that if we spend too much time talking about something like the administration or the citizenship question, you actually depress participation. People, let's say you tell someone, hey, did you know that last summer someone tried to add a question about citizenship? But here, it's not on it. Here's the form. You're gonna turn them off. The research shows it, we've seen it in the field. So important thing is to frame this very positively and say, did you know that by participating in the census, you can help bring funds back into your schools or your local community health center, and people respond pretty positively to messages about public funding. So again, we want people to avoid, if you don't feel comfortable already, we want people to understand that they can avoid the Census Bureau by self-responding. So responding by that April 30th date is going to be really key. And then lastly, I wanted to share some of the campaigns and resources that we have available in case you start doing this work or are promoting the census in your own networks. So one key thing is that you're likely a trusted messenger in your community. So you can, as a trusted messenger, say, hey, I'm going to participate in the census, are you? And so this may include, if you have the capacity, this may include leveraging your existing place of employment. If not, very easily, what we want people to do is to share the word. So how can you as an individual promote a fair and accurate census? So educate and inform your networks. Learn kind of what type of enumeration is going to be happening in your community and make the census tangible. And by this, you want to say, well, tangible in that you say, hey, I'm going to participate in the census, or hey, I just got my mailing. I'm going to do it. Are you going to do it too? And having a quick conversation with someone. To check the type of enumeration is going to happen in your census tract, you can go to Census Hard to Count Maps 2020.us. Another way that we promote a fair and accurate census is to fill out the form early and completely. So we want to remind people, don't forget your babies, your kids, and your non-family members who live with you. And as soon as you get it, fill it out. For the same reasons that I mentioned self-response, we want to support the Bureau, we want to redirect resources, and we want to be able to share the best level of data that we can. And then simply spread the word. So this might be a simple, you likely are on Twitter, Instagram, etc., and just saying, hey, the census is here. And you can promote our number or use our number however you'd like. We have a bilingual hotline that I'm going to talk about in a second. So in terms of how we want to talk about it, you want to say it impacts all of us, regardless of our age, race, income, or immigration status. We want to do this because we know, again, sometimes you have to say the quiet part out loud and remind people that regardless of any of these identities, it's important and key for them to participate. We want to emphasize it's easy, safe, and required. So easy in that it shouldn't take more than 10 to 20 minutes, depending on the size of the family. It's safe, your information is secure, and the government can't use it for anything but statistical purposes. And required, and that everyone does have to fill it out. The message about public funding is very key. So census data provides funding for schools, community programs, and families. And it's a way for all of us to participate in our democracy. For many people, they may not be able to vote for a number of reasons. And so this is kind of a way to say, hey, you can still make yourself count, literally, by participating in the census. So things to keep in mind is that we did a lot of research post-citizenship question, and some key things came out of that. Some of them were things like that many of our community members still believe there's a citizenship question on the form. When we connect the census to the administration, individuals may be scared away. Messaging should emphasize data security and the benefits of the census that are relatable. So you want to include two messages. You want to say, hey, the census is safe. And did you know that it brings back millions of dollars into your local community every year? You want to localize it. So what are the issues that are impacting the people that you work with? Is it student loans? Is it access to housing? What is the issue that people are dealing with? And then people want to hear from you. So if you're a trusted messenger in your community, we've seen that people will look to you to get the green light, right? And we're like that. We want to see that our networks are participating in something so that we know that, oh, okay, they're doing it, then it must be safe, then it's fine. So keep these things in your back pocket as you continue to do this work. We have a ton of resources available already, so things that you can go ahead and download, one-pagers, fact sheets, webinars that are already available to you, so you don't have to recreate the wheel. And then going back to the hotline, so this is 877 El Censo. And this little box here is actually a social media graphic that you can also download and use on in your social networks. And essentially this hotline is something of a hub for information. So if people have questions or concerns, they can call us and we'll do our best to answer their questions. Or if it's something that needs more attention, we'll lift it up to the Bureau or to our national partners. And it's already live and anyone can access it. So it's in English and Spanish, but anybody who may need access to it can call us. And we're really happy that we can provide this service to the community. We have things like, again, social media graphics, videos, short snippets of what the census is and why it's so important. The one-pager, social media graphics. We have collateral for community health centers in case you guys work with them and want to print something out and give it out to people who are walking through the doors. We also have resources from partners across the state. So we have resources from Texans Care for Children, and they made these like really beautiful posters that you can download and put up maybe in the places that you work or visit, and just somewhere where you get a lot of foot traffic and a lot of attention on the issue. The Bureau has a lot of information as well. So for instance, this one says, count everyone under your roof. And this idea is like, you want to make sure everyone counts under any given household. The Bureau has posters for folks who are part of the LGBTQ family. And then in addition for babies, this baby's super cute. And so they really want to emphasize there are some groups that they miss. And so they're trying to tailor the message to those community members. And that's it. I know that was a lot of information. So if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them now.